Welcome to Play It by Tier, a series created by the Switch Clicks. In this series, we review a variety of games, movies, and other media, and we will be placing each of these onto a tier list based on the category. In this episode, we will be reviewing The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword on the Wii, and its HD remaster on the Nintendo Switch. Being one of the most divisive Zelda games ever made, I was unsurprisingly part of the many who disliked the game when it first came out. It is fair to say that jumping from Twilight Princess to this was shockingly underwhelming, especially for a game that was so hyped up after it was first revealed at E3 2010. A special Zelda game to celebrate the franchise's 25-year legacy, with ambitions to be bigger and better than its predecessor, turned out to be a big disappointment. The game took away any sort of real exploration. Fi was more annoying than Navi from Ocarina of Time, and who could forget about the motion controls? Dear God, this took a decent amount of time for me to get used to. As the years gone by, I began to appreciate this game the more I began to notice the amount of depth that Nintendo poured into the story and soundtrack. In this time, I was also adjusting well into the motion controls to the point where I was able to remind myself every now and then to recalibrate, something the game did not tell people to do. Still, as someone who played Twilight Princess on the Wii, the control scheme in Skyward Sword felt very awkward. Using the A button to shoot a slingshot instead of B was just plain wrong, and selecting items was a really big hassle because you had to reach all the way down to the minus button and hold it down while pointing the Wii remote to the screen. Regardless, the game had redeeming factors, notably its story and soundtrack, as mentioned earlier. Being the very first Zelda game to utilize fully orchestrated music, you get a magical feeling that you wouldn't get from any other Zelda game at the time. The music doesn't just feel more meaningful and dramatic, it's also composed very differently than previous games. Pretty much every theme in Skyward Sword is, well, an actual theme. Dungeons all have legitimate music in them as opposed to atmospheric music, and there's just more variety to the music rather than reused themes and variations. Before I talk about the story though, there are some glaring issues this game has, both on the original and the remaster. As you all know already, motion controls were never perfect. They always go out of sync every so often, they're either too weak or too sensitive, and they aren't something that's normally used in games outside of the Wii's library. Even if they are, they're usually supplementary to the core gameplay, and most of the time you can just disable them and play the games traditionally. With Skyward Sword, however, the game was designed with motion controls in mind, and unless you're playing the HD remaster, you had to use motion controls. A lot of people never really liked this considering the Wii offered so many more controller options, but their main problem was that the controllers kept going out of sync. They weren't getting used to getting into the habit of recalibrating their controller every few minutes, even if it takes around 5 seconds every time. In my case, I never had many issues, and it never took me that long to recalibrate my controllers, but I will admit that it does get a bit tedious when you never notice the actual problems appearing. But honestly, I don't think that's the worst of the issues that this game has to offer. I've met several left-handed players who all share one obvious complaint. The game lacks left-handed controls. Unlike other Wii games and even Switch games, both versions of Skyward Sword restrict the player to using their right hand to swing the sword, as opposed to giving the option for both hands. I get why this may have been an issue for Nintendo, because they would have had to mirror every single thing and potentially mess up some of the in-game textures. But they mirrored the map for Twilight Princess twice already, and both times it worked out just fine. I don't see why they couldn't have made left-handed controls. I can understand that on the Wii, you would have to use your right hand to use the nunchuck, but some games offer that kind of option, labeled as Southpaw controls. On the Switch, it was an inexcusable mistake. The Joy-Cons are designed to cater to both hands, and both Joy-Cons have the same number of buttons, and both support motion controls. There were so many potential ways to play Skyward Sword HD, yet they chose not to do that. I don't even want to get to the glitches, because there are surprisingly a number of them to cover. There was the infamous Song of the Hero softlock where if you talked to a certain character before finishing a part of the game would cease to progress. On the Wii, that was patched using a whole freaking software channel that you had to download off of the Wii U Shop channel. Rest in peace, Wii Shop channel. But enough of the issues. Time to talk about the story. I'm not going to go too in-depth because honestly, it's worth it for you to experience this yourself. Basically, you're playing a movie. The game introduced a lot of memorable characters, most famously Groose. Groose can come off as the sort of cliché school bully, Gaston type of guy who tries to woo your love interest, only to find out that your crush is interested in you instead. Zelda in this game is much less of the formal wise princess who we saw from previous games, and is much more relatable and outgoing. She's the one who you would see as your best friend. Then we have Fi, who really took the brunt of the memes for Skyward Sword. Fi is probably comparable to your typical static, non-emotional robot character who eventually adapts to human life throughout the course of the story. However, I think many of us already know Fi for another reason, and it's pretty much the reason why we don't have a companion character in Zelda games anymore. There is rarely an instance where Fi doesn't want to help you. You find yourself constantly getting interrupted by Fi, and there are points in the game where the notification noise keeps chiming non-stop until you decide to talk to Fi. It gets pretty annoying, especially in certain instances where your Wii Remote batteries are running low because you forgot to charge them beforehand or you forgot to get a new set of batteries. The pacing of the story feels very nice, and the game starts to really draw out some of those emotions, especially near the beginning and the end of the game. You'll find yourself really interested in this story, and I would honestly consider it to be one of the best in the Zelda franchise. Moving back to the gameplay, there's honestly not much to say outside of the motion controls. Skyward Sword HD introduced button-only controls, which I initially thought were impossible to pull off. You could ask Eiji Aonuma in an interview back in 2018, as he also said it would be impossible, but I guess he changed his mind. It is worth noting, though, that button controls are pretty game-breaking because of how fast you can attack compared to motion control. Speaking of which, one of the things that makes Skyward Sword different is the combat. Many of the enemies, especially the bosses, rely on specific directional attacks. They'll block your attack if you hit the wrong direction, and sometimes counter and strike you down if you're not careful. However, that's really all there is to it. The combat still feels normal, despite the gimmicks. Your main method of transportation is flying on your loft wing, though I would argue that it barely counts as the main way of traveling, if half the game involves you walking through a world-sized dungeon. There were complaints that the flying was slow, but I think that's partially because the game barely told you that physics actually existed when flying. Who would have thought that? As for everywhere else, the way the world was designed really feels like it can be done in one linear path. I can't remember any location that requires backtracking more than at least 3 times. Even a world like Breath of the Wild has more backtracking because there's always a reason to. It's not a bad thing to travel such a linear path, but it means you can't repeatedly replay this game in the short term. Now, as for the side quests, they're all jumbled up into one big side quest for collectibles. Even if you could count them as collectibles, every side quest completion gives you these collectibles, which you give to a character for some rewards. Even though the game incentivizes you to be very materialistic, the end reward for this side quest comes a little too late in the game to be really satisfying, especially when you're so incredibly focused on beating the main story at this point. Speaking of story, the game has 7 dungeons, considerably less for an average Zelda game, but contrary to that, Skyward Sword had probably one of the most bosses in a Zelda game, and most of them were quite memorable. In conclusion, as an origin story for the Master Sword, Skyward Sword did pretty well under the numerous challenges involved in making a prequel. Not just any prequel, but the prequel to the Zelda franchise. We've seen numerous new species and characters who we never get to see in any other Zelda game, and the lore itself feels very different from your average Zelda game. The game itself is definitely very underrated, and I feel pretty bad that there are some who still neglect this game today. Being the last Zelda game played in a third-person perspective before Breath of the Wild, this game really deserves a lot more credit than it got. It introduced durability, and the ability to mark beacons on the map. It gave us the sailcloth, which was originally going to be in Breath of the Wild, instead of the paraglider. Breath of the Wild features some locations from Skyward Sword, such as the Spring of Power in Breath of the Wild resembling the Spring of Courage in Skyward Sword. There was also the Great Plateau, where Hyrule was first established, as seen at the end of Skyward Sword. Completing the Trial of the Sword in Breath of the Wild plays the same fanfare that plays every time you upgrade your sword in Skyward Sword. Most importantly, Skyward Sword makes a direct impact on Breath of the Wild's story through one character, Fi. The character who many people were annoyed by is the same character in Breath of the Wild who told Zelda that Link could be saved from death. With that in mind, I would like to give Skyward Sword a C. There were a lot of redeeming factors like the story and soundtrack, but I think the gameplay could definitely do better in terms of accessibility and bug fixes. I think you may have noticed, I keep drawing all sorts of comparisons to Breath of the Wild. It's not like Breath of the Wild was my first Zelda game, but there is a pretty big reason why I'm doing it, and that's not just because of Zelda Month. A certain game looms over the horizon of 2022, and I want to prepare for it in every way possible. even if it means moving backwards first. Thank you for watching this episode of Play It By Tier, and I'll see you next week.